Good evening, wanderer of stories. Tonight we journey back to the dawn of human curiosity, when the sky itself seemed to whisper secrets of power beyond imagination. In those early hours before writing, untrained eyes first spotted brilliant forks of light tearing through a velvet night, hinting at a force that would one day light our homes and charge our devices. You probably won't survive the shock of how long it took us to tame it. Find a comfortable spot, allow your shoulders to soften, and let the steady rhythm of your breath guide you towards stillness. While you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy my work. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what hour glows on your clock. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before Benjamin Franklin strapped a key to a kite, our ancestors regarded lightning as the breath of gods waging war above. Ancient Mesopotamians carved crude depictions of jagged bolts on clay tablets, believing each flash was an omen from Inanna herself. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks whispered that Zeus hurled thunderbolts like fiery javelins. These early civilizations recorded thunderbolts not with instruments, but with awe, treating them as both divine punishment and the first hint of nature's hidden force. Historians still argue whether these stories served purely religious purposes, or if shamans secretly tracked storm patterns to predict seasonal floods. Imagine standing on a windswept plain, the air thick with ozone before the storm arrives. You'd feel the hairs on your arms stand on end, a subtle magnetism in the air, and a distant rumble like the growl of a giant beast. In the Indus Valley, priests noted that storms arrived more often in scorching summers, a fringe tidbit suggesting they might have linked rain with celestial fury long before modern meteorology. They had no capacitor jars or copper wires, yet somehow sensed that these bright lances of light were not merely spectacle, but hinting at a deeper, unseen energy. In ancient China, oracle bones unearthed centuries later would reveal that Shang dynasty diviners cast turtle shells to foretell lightning strikes, an early attempt to decode nature's electric script. They described dragon fire piercing the sky and worried it would scorch crops or spark wildfires. One mainstream historical fact is that by 2000 BCE, Chinese records already differentiated between dry lightning, which crackles without rain, and wet lightning that drenches the earth. Such distinctions demonstrate an empirical streak, rarely attributed to pre-scientific peoples. Yet for all their reverence, these observers lacked a way to harness or even replicate lightning. Tales of willow branches struck by bolts would spread, showing charred bark and leaves fused together. Primitive evidence that electricity left a tangible mark. They could not store it or bottle it, but they knew it battered everything it touched with an invisible force. A quirky detail passed down through Greek folklore tells of a hero who wrapped wet cloth around his arms to survive a bolt's wrath, inadvertently inventing a crude form of electrical insulation. As the centuries passed, scribes continued to sketch lightning's signature zigzags on temple walls. By the late 1st millennium BCE, some Roman writers speculated that lightning might resemble the sparks seen when amber was rubbed. Historians still argue whether this comparison arose independently or through early trade between Mediterranean cultures and merchants who carried amber from the Baltic Sea. Either way, these scattered notes planted a seed. Electricity could be more than a divine spectacle. It might be a natural phenomenon to investigate. These first glimmers of lightning power laid the foundation for a long arc of curiosity. Even as priests and kings viewed storms as acts of capricious deities, they inadvertently catalogued patterns and described behaviors that centuries later would be vital clues. Every bolt drawn on clay or carved in relief was an entry in humanity's collective notebook, inching us toward the day when a simple kite string could unlock nature's fury, rather than merely fear it. By the dawn of the 17th century, electricity had taken the first tentative step out of the heavens and into laboratories across Europe. Scholars armed with polished glass spheres and chunks of amber began to chase the same spark that once split the sky. In 1600, an English physician published a treatise noting that when you rub amber against cloth, tiny sparks leap from the surface, creating a crackling glow and a faint, almost metallic scent in the air. This observation marked the birth of experimental electricity as we know it. Historians still argue whether this discovery was a deliberate attempt to replicate lightning or merely an amusing parlor trick. One mainstream historical fact is that William Gilbert, physician to Queen Elizabeth I, coined the term electricus in his book De Magnete, describing the amber effect in detail. He distinguished between magnetism and this new electric virtue, noting that rubbed amber attracted light objects such as bits of straw and feathers. He even compared the attraction to how a lodestone draws iron filings. Yet Gilbert lacked any concept of current or voltage. His experiments produced only momentary attraction and a quick flash of light. Beyond Gilbert, the Royal Society in London became a hub of static experiments. Francis Hauksbee's famous machine of 1,705 forced air through a glass globe, spinning at high speed to build up charge and produce a bright violet glow inside, like a miniature storm cloud frozen in motion. Spectators described the eerie pinkish light as if lightning had been bottled and set adrift in a glass orb. A fringe tidbit from one journal recounts that Hauksbee sometimes startled assistants by clapping his hands beneath the charged globe and causing sparks to jump at will. Meanwhile, on the continent, German inventors experimented with Leyden-like jars decades before the name appeared. They wrapped metal foil around wooden barrels, creating crude capacitors that briefly stored static charge. One anecdote tells of a curious student who touched the barrel after a vigorous rubbing session and was jolted backward with such force that his wig flew off, an early warning about the power hidden in these simple devices. Sensory details abound in accounts from these early demonstrations. Spectators recall the smell of ozone, sharp and electric, tingling at the back of the throat whenever sparks flew. They heard the soft hiss of discharge, like a serpent's whisper, and saw tiny motes of light dancing in the air. Some even reported a taste of metal on their tongues, as if the air itself carried particles of charged copper. Historians still argue whether these static experiments taught researchers anything about the true nature of electricity or merely distracted them with dazzling displays. Some suggest that the focus on amber and glass delayed the search for continuous current by decades. Others contend that without these foundational curiosities, no one would have imagined electricity could flow rather than just flicker. As the century progressed, electrified shows became fashionable across Europe. Noblemen invited experimenters to court, where guests would marvel at sparks drawn between knuckles and metal rods. The attraction of the static charge was more than scientific. It was entertainment, a novelty that promised both wonder and a mild shock. Devices called friction machines appeared in salons, built from glass plates and leather pads, turning the act of generating lightning into an elegant parlor performance. By the 1740s, scientific societies dissected every detail. They debated whether rubbing amber and glass produced the same phenomenon as storms overhead. Some argued that the color of sparks, pale blue from glass, deep orange from amber, indicated different forces at work. Others pointed out that humidity could suppress the glow entirely, proving dependence on air conditions. These debates slowly nudged researchers toward understanding that electricity was a fundamental property of matter, not a supernatural force. In this era of static sparks, the line between science and spectacle blurred. Experiments were recorded in lavishly illustrated books, where woodcut prints showed curious onlookers leaning into tables, their hair standing on end. One quirky detail finds its way into a Dutch account. A nobleman, so intent on seeing a spark, held a peeled potato beneath a charged globe, causing the vegetable to pop like popcorn when discharged. These experiments did more than entertain. They laid the conceptual groundwork for storing charge, for measuring attraction, and for grappling with the idea that invisible forces could be coaxed from common materials. Without these static displays, later inventors would have lacked the basic language of positive and negative, of insulator and conductor. By the time Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment came into view, the world already understood that rubbed materials could attract and repel. They knew that metal rods could conduct, and that jars could trap a charge. What remained was connecting the bolt to the spark, the storm to the machine. That bridge would be built on the shoulders of these early amber and glass pioneers, whose flickering sparks ignited centuries of discovery. When Benjamin Franklin launched his kite into the brooding Pennsylvania sky in June of 1752, he was neither seeking a stuntman's fame nor performing a children's afternoon pastime. He was testing a radical hypothesis that the same force crackling through the heavens also coursed through rubbed glass and amber in European laboratories. Historians still argue whether Franklin's famous experiment took place during a full-blown thunderstorm or merely a drizzling, overcast day that suppressed the worst of the danger. What remains certain is that this improvised atmospheric probe transformed electricity from a laboratory curiosity into a natural phenomenon to be studied and harnessed. Franklin fastened a simple metal key to his kite's wooden frame, trailing down a moistened silk string to a Leyden jar below. As storm clouds gathered, the damp twine conducted faint charges, producing tiny sparks that leapt from the jar's mouth on command. One mainstream historical fact is that Franklin described the crackling discharge and his observations in a letter to the Royal Society, effectively proving that lightning and electric sparks share the same nature. This correspondence leapt across the Atlantic almost as fast as the electrical connections it described. Contemporary witnesses reported a sharp, metallic scent in the damp air at the moment the sparks began to fly. The aroma of rain-soaked cotton mingled with that faint tang of ozone, conjuring a sensory memory not unlike opening a static-charged bag of potato chips. A fringe tidbit from a local tavern chronicle humorously notes that Franklin's servant stole several sparks by rubbing metal utensils together in the kitchen later that evening, hoping to recreate the famous demonstration for curious guests. Such anecdotes reveal how quickly the notion of controlled electricity captured the public imagination. Franklin's intent was far from spectacle. He sought practical applications and proposed mounting pointed metal rods atop buildings to draw off lethal charges before they could strike vulnerable structures. Early lightning rods of iron or brass appeared in Philadelphia within months, providing the first tangible example of mitigating nature's destructive whims. These rods were hailed as architectural talismans, though some clergy complained that redirecting divine fury robbed God of his rightful dramatic flair. Historians still argue whether public acceptance of lightning rods was driven by genuine safety concerns or by the allure of technological novelty. The experiment itself teetered on the edge of absurdity. No insulating gloves or bespoke safety gear protected Franklin. He stood in soggy fields, soaked tunic clinging to his skin, as the wind whipped around him. One recluse's journal describes lightning rods sparking unintentionally when birds alighted on them, prompting feathers and droppings to fly in every direction. In Franklin's own account, he remarked on the irony that harnessing the same force that fried eagles from the sky required such humble materials as a kite, a silk ribbon, and a household key. Following the kite demonstration, Franklin's paper invited European tinkerers to experiment with miniature lightning rods and indoor sparking devices. At salons in Paris and London, gentlemen wrapped wet threads around keys or needles, drawing sparks from electrified bottles and comparing results with Franklin's sketches. They reported a whispery hissing as charge pooled and a faint glow flickering at metal tips. Some experimented by placing electrified jars beneath bed springs, attempting to zap away nocturnal aches, a humorous precursor to modern TENS units. The notion that cracked slabs of bone or dried gourds could deliver therapeutic jolts reflected the era's willingness to mix fringe medicine with frontier science. While Franklin's correspondence provided detailed instructions, historians still argue whether his experiment truly inspired contemporaries to adopt lightning rods for safety or whether the practice spread more quickly due to commercial rivalry among London instrument makers. Regardless, by the mid-1750s, rooks and sparrows perched atop rods in cities from Boston to Bordeaux, often perching comically close to their metal presidencies, before zooming off in a flurry of feathers. Sensory recollections from early adopters detail the tactile chill of metal surfaces minutes after a storm's passage. Some described a spark that felt like a bee sting when touched by hand, delivering a stinging nip that left a lingering hum in the fingertips. One eccentric scholar insisted that the residual charge left a subtle tingling in one's toes and a soft murmur in the walls, as though buildings themselves spoke in an electrical dialect. By converting lightning's capricious violence into a manageable flow, Franklin and his successors bridged the gap between natural spectacle and controlled energy. His kite did more than prove a theory. It symbolized humanity's first real claim on the sky's hidden power. In the years that followed, electricity was no longer relegated to themed demonstrations. It was summoned into laboratories, funneled into wires, and set on a path toward the domestic wonders of light bulbs, motors, and early telegraph lines. This pivotal moment cemented the idea that electricity need not strike at random. It had rules, conductors, insulators, and an emergent nomenclature of positive and negative. All of this began with a man, a kite, and a key. And by daring to challenge the sky, Franklin opened the door to centuries of discovery that would ultimately transform every corner of daily life. By the mid-18th century, the quest to replicate and store electrical charge moved beyond amber and glass spheres into devices designed specifically for containment. In 1745, Pieter van Musschenbroek of Leyden accidentally discovered that a simple glass jar lined with metal foil and topped with a conducting rod could trap charge long enough to produce a startling jolt on demand. This Leyden jar marked the first real attempt to bottle electricity rather than merely watch it flicker. Historians still argue whether Van Musschenbroek truly grasped the significance of his invention, or if luck played the larger role, since the very first shocks he received reportedly left him momentarily stunned and eager to warn colleagues of the hidden danger. The Leyden jar's basic design, an inner and outer conductor, separated by glass as the insulator, became the laboratory centerpiece for demonstrations across Europe. Visitors gawked as technicians drew sparks that arced across a small gap, accompanied by a sharp sizzle and the smell of ozone, like a fresh thunderstorm trapped indoors. One quirky account describes a scholar who attempted to recharge a jar after every demonstration, only to discover that prolonged use warped the glass and deposited strange metallic residues that mimicked traces of copper and tin. Such residues perplexed chemists who had yet to develop modern analytical methods. Soon after, inventors recognized that multiple jars connected in series could amplify voltage. Called a battery of Leyden jars, this configuration produced jolts powerful enough to shatter ceramic tiles if discharged recklessly. Sensory reports from these early experiments mention a sudden crack, reminiscent of a whip, followed by a faint metallic taste lingering on the tongue. Spectators often recoiled, some complaining of ringing ears and residual tingling in their fingertips. Debate persists over whether these dramatic demonstrations helped accelerate theoretical advances or merely distracted scientists with the sensational showmanship. Enter Alessandro Volta, who by 1800 devised a completely different approach. Inspired by the chemical experiments of Luigi Galvani, who had observed frog legs twitching when touched by two different metals, Volta stacked alternating discs of zinc and copper separated by salt-soaked cardboard. This voltaic pile generated a steady current rather than intermittent sparks. One mainstream historical fact is that Volta's pile produced continuous flow, laying the groundwork for practical electrical circuits. Historians still argue whether Galvani's biological interpretations or Volta's chemical understanding deserves priority in the discovery of galvanism. Volta's invention also introduced new sensory experiences in the laboratory. Researchers noted a steady hum from the pile under load, like a distant chorus of insect wings, and observed that water near the terminals sometimes fizzed as dissolved gases bubbled forth. A fringe tidbit tells of a young assistant who, curious about the pile's power, submerged his hand to feel the current, only to withdraw it with a scream that echoed through the corridors. Though the shock was mild compared to later batteries, it reinforced the notion that electricity could be a tangible, controllable resource. With charge now storable and flow continuous, attention turned to measurement and control. Scientists designed early galvanometers, using magnetic needles deflected by current in wire coils, producing a soft creak as the pointer swung. Records from one Paris laboratory describe the room growing still, except for the needle's whispery shift, earning the device the nickname the Silent Judge. Yet, developing standardized units proved contentious. Historians still argue whether Volta's chemical cell should define the volt, or if later conventions, like Ohm's resistance laws, should take precedence in naming the unit. By the 1820s, the principles of conductors, insulators, and circuit elements were basic currency among experimenters. Workshops were filled with spools of copper wire, lengths of silk-covered thread serving as insulation, and banks of jars waiting to be discharged. One peculiar detail from a London account records that a curious aristocrat once insisted on receiving his morning coffee brewed by water heated through an early experimental resistor, hoping electric warmth would taste different. It did not, but the attempt illustrated the era's readiness to blend serious study with idiosyncratic curiosity. The combined breakthroughs of the Leyden jar and the voltaic pile thus transformed electricity from a series of static curiosities into a dynamic force that could be generated, stored, and measured. Laboratories no longer waited for storm clouds. They summoned power at will. Yet the path to practical application remained uncertain, as scholars debated the best way to integrate these discoveries into useful machines. That bridge would soon be built by those who saw beyond sparks and juice jars to the possibilities of motors, lighting, and communication across wires. The early 19th century ushered in a wave of theoretical insight and practical ingenuity that tamed electricity for everyday use. Michael Faraday's experiments in 1831 demonstrated electromagnetic induction, showing that moving a magnet through a coil produced a steady current in the wire. This mainstream historical fact laid the foundation for electric generators and transformers. Historians still argue whether Faraday's laboratory notebooks or his public lectures did more to inspire contemporaries, since many young inventors heard him speak long before they gained access to his detailed sketches. Faraday's laboratory was redolent with the scent of polished wood and heated metal, and witnesses recall the soft hum of spinning machinery echoing off brick walls. A fringe tidbit claims that after an especially vigorous demo, Faraday's assistant discovered that nearby candles flickered in unison with the current fluctuations, as though the flame itself danced to an unseen electrical rhythm. These synesthetic effects fueled a belief that electricity might one day animate far more than wires and bulbs. Meanwhile, on the theoretical front, James Clerk Maxwell synthesized observations into a set of equations in the 1860s, uniting electricity and magnetism into a single electromagnetic field theory. His work predicted that oscillating currents would radiate waves at the speed of light, long before wireless communication existed. Historians still argue whether Maxwell's mathematical elegance, or Heinrich Hertz's later experimental confirmation, merits greater credit for ushering in the age of radio. As theory and experiment converged, inventors raced to build practical applications. Thomas Edison favored direct current, improving incandescent lamps and creating a downtown network in New York City. Meanwhile, Nikola Tesla championed alternating current and designed transformers and motors that could transmit power over long distances. One quirky anecdote describes Tesla lighting 200 lamps wirelessly at a Philadelphia exposition, causing the audience to gasp as bulbs flickered aloft without visible connections. Debate lingers over whether Edison's vast patent portfolio or Tesla's visionary designs truly set the path for the modern grid. Industrial plants hummed with arc lights during the late 19th century, replacing gas, lamps, and candles in factories and street corners. The smell of burning carbon electrodes mingled with coal smoke, reminding workers that modern conveniences often carried old-world byproducts. Early power stations required thick cables pulsing with current, their insulation sometimes failing and producing faint pops and the smell of scorched rubber. Despite these hazards, homes lit by electric bulbs felt almost magical, as though a captured thunderbolt now served domestic needs. By the turn of the century, every corner of daily life began to depend on electricity. Electric motors ran fans, pumps, and sewing machines, replacing muscle power in homes and workshops. The first electric streetcars rattled through city streets, their overhead wires a testament to humanity's new control over the sky's form of fury. A peculiar detail from early 20th century catalogues offered electrically heated socks, marketed with the claim that they would ward off chilblains better than wool, an early hint at wearable electric convenience. As mass electrification spread, standardization became critical. Units for volts, amperes, and ohms honored the pioneers' names, embedding scientific history into everyday language. Massive hydroelectric dams harnessed rivers with turbines turned by water, generating gigawatts of power without a single jar of stored charge in sight. The buzz of fluorescent lights in offices and the hum of refrigerators in kitchens became the new soundtrack of modern life. Today's interconnected grid, smart devices, and renewable energy sources all trace their lineage back to static sparks in amber, Franklin's kite, and Volta's piles. The relentless march from unpredictable lightning bolts to the controlled flow powering digital worlds illustrates one of history's greatest triumphs over nature. It reminds observers that every breakthrough rests on the shoulders of curious minds, willing to chase a spark into the unknown and wrest it into service for daily life. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17, 1706, in a crowded Boston home smelling of fresh ink and pipe smoke, the 10th of 17 children, in a modest candlemaker's family. From the start, he exhibited a curious mind, absorbing every scrap of news while his older brothers learned trades. At age 10, formal schooling ended for him, not due to misbehavior, but because his father believed practical skills outweighed Latin declensions. Historians still argue whether leaving school early curtailed Franklin's classical education or propelled him into the real world faster, shaping his famously pragmatic intellect. As a youth, Franklin found work in his brother James's print shop, where the clatter of the press and the sharp scent of ink became the backdrop of his adolescence. He learned to set type by hand, feeling each small metal letter click into place under his fingers. One quirky detail from an 18th century diary recalls that Franklin sometimes read forbidden political pamphlets by candlelight at night, slipping them under his shirt to avoid his brother's noticed disapproval. Those clandestine readings stoked his early interest in free expression and dissent. In 1723, at 17, Franklin slipped away for London, working as an apprentice in a major printing house on Lincoln's Inn Fields. The bustling city offered him more than technical training. It exposed him to coffee-house debates about virtue, commerce, and the nature of government. He described the aroma of roasted beans mingling with fresh newspapers at the Grecian coffee house, where patrons argued fiercely yet politely over pamphlets and letters. One mainstream historical fact is that Franklin lived in London until 1726, publishing his first essays under various pseudonyms and absorbing the city's intellectual currents. Yet his time abroad was far from smooth. He endured cramped lodgings and occasional bouts of homesickness, nursing a fondness for corn porridge that reminded him of his mother's kitchen. Historians still argue whether his relative anonymity in London dampened his confidence or whether it reinforced his belief that reputation must be earned. Anecdotes describe him roaming Fleet Street at dawn, the fog swirling around gaslit lamps, as he gathered scraps of paper for makeshift notebooks and scribbled observations on local politics. By the time he sailed back to Boston, Franklin had sharpened his pen and broadened his ambitions. He returned not merely as a journeyman printer, but as a man with plans to revolutionize the colonial press. He founded the Pennsylvania Gazette within a few years, transforming a struggling paper into one of the colony's most influential publications. He introduced witty essays, bold critiques of authority, and witty epigrams that tickled readers. One fringe tidbit notes that he once dared to publish a provocative poem about a local magistrate's wig, prompting a brief libel suit that ended in Franklin's favor and established a precedent for free speech in the colonies. Franklin's apprenticeship in London also introduced him to the workings of volunteer societies, inspiring him to champion civic improvement on his return. He helped organize Philadelphia's first lending library, saving subscribers a penny a week in rental fees and fostering shared learning. He described the library's quiet interior as filled with the soft rustle of pages and the faint aroma of leather bindings, an atmosphere that mirrored the coffee houses of his youth, but without the discord of political pamphleteering. Throughout these early years, Franklin cultivated a habit of self-education, setting aside 1 hour daily for reading and 1 hour for reflection. He called these mind-expanding hours and credited them with freeing him from the narrow constraints of his birth. Whether reading modern scientific journals or classical philosophy, he chronicled every insight in neatly bound journals. Historians still argue whether this disciplined regimen was the secret to his success or an over-engineered routine that few could sustain. By the end of the 1720s, Franklin's time as a London apprentice had yielded more than printing skills. It bestowed upon him a global perspective and a network of intellectual contacts. When he later returned to London as a colonial agent in the 1750s, he tapped into those early connections at coffee houses and printing houses to lobby for colonial interests. His earlier years among English printers proved invaluable in navigating the corridors of power, suggesting that apprenticeship was more than vocational training. It was the crucible of his future diplomatic finesse. Franklin's transformation from journeyman printer to self-made publisher began in 1729, when he deftly acquired the struggling Pennsylvania Gazette for the equivalent of a few bushels of wheat and a promise to settle outstanding debts. At the time, Philadelphia's print market was sparse, with hand-operated presses coughing out half-forgotten sermons and government proclamations. Franklin recognized that a vibrant, opinionated paper could captivate a growing colonial populace and cement his reputation beyond mere craftsmanship. One mainstream historical fact is that under Franklin's editorship, the Gazette's circulation soared from a few hundred to over 2,000 subscribers by the mid-1730s, making it the most read paper in the colonies. Historians still argue whether this rapid growth stemmed from Franklin's savvy editorial choices or simply from the Gazette's monopoly in a city hungry for news. Operating from a cramped shop on Market Street, Franklin oversaw every step of production. He would rise before dawn to stoke the coal stove that warmed the press room, its iron plates radiating brittle heat. The air was thick with the tang of smoke, ink, and the faintly sweet scent of freshly baked bread drifting in from a neighbouring bakery. Apprentices in leather aprons arranged metal type by hand, each small block clinking as it clicked into a chase. Franklin himself selected essays, folded pages, and supervised the distribution of sheets before sunrise. His coarse voice cut through the clatter. "Make every letter count," he'd remind younger printers with a wry grin. Beyond routine news, Franklin injected the Gazette with biting wit and satirical flair. He penned anonymous hoaxes and playful pseudonymous letters, lampooning local officials for inflated taxes or overzealous sermons. One quirky fringe tidbit tells of a midnight printing of an essay on the freedom of the press, financed by Franklin to test the city's tolerance for dissent. The pamphlet's pages were scattered across cobblestones at dawn, prompting flustered constables to chase chickens rather than agitators. This audacious stunt not only boosted readership, but also signaled that Franklin understood publicity as well as prose. In 1732, Franklin further expanded his publishing empire by releasing Poor Richard's Almanac, authored under the persona Richard Saunders. This yearly compendium mixed weather forecasts with proverbs, some homespun, others borrowed from ancient sources, alongside puzzles and practical household tips. A mainstream fact is that by its final edition in 1758, the almanac had sold over 10,000 copies, making it the best-selling colonial publication. Historians still argue whether Saunders' homespun maxims, "early to bed" and "early to rise," reflected Franklin's own philosophy or merely echoed widely circulated European proverbs repackaged for American tastes. The Gazette and the Almanac complemented each other. Subscribers who enjoyed Benjamin's colonial news soon found themselves anticipating Richard's witticisms. Franklin orchestrated cross-promotion, printing excerpts from the Almanac in the Gazette and offering bundled subscriptions. He also pioneered advertising, selling space to local merchants hawking pamphlets, powdered wigs, and imported herring. One peculiar detail from a surviving receipt shows a Philadelphia tobacconist paying in half-pound increments of snuff, stamped onto the Gazette's masthead in tiny copperplate letters. Franklin's editorial calendar followed seasonal rhythms and civic calendars. In spring, he printed guidebooks for surveying land, complete with rudimentary maps and cautions against swampy plots. He timed agricultural advice to farmers' needs, advising crop rotation while cautioning that excessive potato planting could lead to dishwashing folly. In fall, he published ballads celebrating harvest fairs, invoking smells of fresh cider and charred ears of corn. These flourishes gave the Gazette a distinct local flavour, forging a sense of community in print form. Yet publishing was not all smooth sailing. Competitors emerged in New York and Boston, and rival printers occasionally accused Franklin of stealing type or pirating essays. One notable spat involved a pamphlet entitled The Female Quixote, which satirized a Boston socialite. The backlash included angry letters scrawled in the Gazette's margins accusing Franklin of moral corruption. He responded with measured editorials defending the public's right to laughter and debate. Historians still argue whether this defense stemmed from genuine conviction in free speech or from business pragmatism to protect his brand. Franklin's success also stemmed from his willingness to experiment with new technology. In 1730, he installed a second press operated by a larger, heavier flywheel that could print nearly twice the number of sheets per hour. The increased output allowed him to extend distribution to rural Pennsylvania towns and even into parts of Delaware and Maryland. Remnants of wooden rollers and buckled Platen plates survive in museum collections, bearing testament to the physical toll exacted by relentless printing presses. By the late 1730s, Franklin had become more than a printer. He was a public intellectual. Fellow publishers sought his advice on typecasting and composition, and apprentices travelled miles to learn under his tutelage. He maintained correspondences with London printers, exchanging samples of paper stock and trade secrets. One curious anecdote notes that he once sent a parcel of Pennsylvania-grown flax to a London paper mill, aiming to create a uniquely American rag paper. The experiment failed when the fibers proved too coarse, but the attempt illustrated Franklin's entrepreneurial mindset. Throughout this period, Franklin balanced commerce with civic engagement. He used the Gazette to support Pennsylvania's newly formed volunteer militia against potential French incursions, printing leaflets urging men to muster. He also published moral essays advocating temperance and civic responsibility. These acts blurred the line between publisher and politician, positioning Franklin at the center of colonial life. He recognized that the printed word could shape public opinion as powerfully as any speech from a pulpit. As the years passed, Franklin's dual roles as publisher and civic leader intertwined. He organized the American Philosophical Society and mentored young writers who would later become revolutionary leaders. His publishing ventures provided both the platform and the resources to nurture ideas of independence and self-governance. In this way, the humble print shop on Market Street became the seedbed for a new nation's intellectual identity. Franklin's restless curiosity found new outlets beyond the printing press, as he turned his attention to civic improvement and scientific inquiry in Philadelphia. In 1731, he founded the Library Company of Philadelphia, the colony's first subscription library, offering shared access to books in an era when volumes cost more than a modest household's monthly wages. One mainstream historical fact is that by 1741, the Library Company's collection had grown to over 2 volumes, covering subjects from navigation to natural philosophy. Historians still argue whether Franklin envisioned the library primarily as a vehicle for self-education or as a social experiment to foster public debate. The library's reading room was lit by oil lamps whose wicks hissed softly and filled the air with a faint aroma of burning whale oil. Visitors described the hush broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional cough echoing against wooden shelves. One fringe tidbit comes from a ledger entry noting that a scholar once sneaked in a pet canary, whose cheerful song startled patrons accustomed to scholarly silence. The incident prompted a rule forbidding live birds, though it underscored the library's role as a community gathering place rather than a solemn archive. Franklin's scientific pursuits gained public attention around the same time. In 1744, he published Experiments and Observations on Electricity, recounting his systematic studies of electric charge, and proposing the concept of a single electrical fluid with positive and negative states. He suggested that pointed rods could draw off charge from clouds, a proposal grounded in his earlier kite experiment. This publication marked the colony's first major contribution to international science. Historians still argue whether Franklin's electrical theory owed more to European correspondence with Collinson and Dalibard or to his independent insights. Readers of Franklin's treatise noted the clear, conversational style he employed, a departure from the dense Latin prose common in European journals. He described the tactile sensation of sparks jumping from his fingertips as a stinging nip, like a wasp's bite, and recounted the crackling hiss that accompanied discharge in damp air. Such vivid sensory details made the work accessible and galvanized both amateur experimenters and professional scientists. One quirky anecdote involves a friend who attempted to replicate Franklin's Leyden jar experiment using hollowed-out gourds as insulators, only to find the gourds smoked and burst when charged. Franklin's proposals led to the installation of the first lightning rods in Philadelphia, atop the State House and Christ Church, by 1752. The pointed iron rods, often capped with brass finials, clashed visually with the Georgian architecture and sparked controversy among clergy who viewed them as sacrilegious meddling with divine will. Congregants reported hearing thundering roars, even on calm days, attributing the noise to unseen friction between rod and air. Historians still argue whether these complaints reflected genuine theological objections or served as pretexts for resisting technological change. Beyond electricity, Franklin's civic innovations included the creation of Philadelphia's first volunteer fire department in 1736. He organized citizens into brigades equipped with hand-pumped engines that spewed water in jerky bursts, accompanied by the pungent scent of wet leather hoses and the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestone streets. One fringe detail suggests that Franklin once tested a new fire alarm system by setting off bells at dawn, inadvertently waking a sleeping town and prompting a collective grumble about premature summons. Despite the hiccup, the department became a model for urban fire safety in North America. Franklin also championed public health initiatives during a yellow fever outbreak in 1741. He helped establish the city's first hospital, noting that ventilated wards with open windows and heavy curtains soaked in vinegar offered better patient outcomes than crowded, stagnant rooms. Observers recalled the sharp tang of vinegar and the muted groans of fevered patients drifting through the hospital corridors. Historians still argue whether Franklin's emphasis on ventilation reflected true medical insight or merely common practices borrowed from European plague responses. In the realm of infrastructure, Franklin spearheaded improvements to Philadelphia's street lighting by advocating for iron lampposts with glass lanterns fueled by whale oil. These lamps cast a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the city's notorious nighttime shadows, reducing crime and encouraging evening commerce. A peculiar record in City Minutes notes that lamp tenders often sang hymns as they lit each lantern, their voices carried on damp air and mingling with the smell of burnt oil and damp brick. Through these endeavors, Franklin cultivated a reputation not merely as a theorist, but as a problem solver who relished practical challenges. His home workshop, cluttered with glass tubes, metal rods, and early voltaic cells, buzzed with experiments that sometimes ended in small explosions or unexpected flashes of light. Family members recalled the smell of scorched copper and the sudden clatter of fallen tools whenever an experiment went awry. Franklin took such mishaps in stride, jotting down each failure alongside successes in meticulously kept notebooks. By the late 1750s, Franklin's blend of scientific writing and civic leadership had earned him international acclaim. He corresponded with Voltaire in Paris, exchanged letters with Benjamin Martin on immunity concepts, and received honorary memberships in European scientific societies. Yet, even at the height of his fame, he remained engaged in local affairs, using his printing press to advocate for the creation of hospitals, street grids, and public baths. His legacy in Philadelphia echoed beyond stone and ink, manifesting in institutions that continued to shape urban life well into the next century. By 1757, Benjamin Franklin had earned a reputation that stretched far beyond colonial newspapers, and he was appointed colonial agent to the British government in London, a role that marked his first formal foray into diplomacy. In stately Whitehall, he moved among red-coated ministers and powdered wigs, negotiating on behalf of Pennsylvania and later Massachusetts, Georgia, and other colonies. One mainstream historical fact is that Franklin served as colonial agent in London from 1757 until 1775, lobbying Parliament to repeal trade restrictions and promote colonial interests. Historians still argue whether his success lay more in his witty pamphlets or in cultivated personal relationships with key ministers. London's damp air clung to his coat as he navigated narrow cobblestone streets towards St James's Coffee House, a gathering place for politicians and intellectuals. Inside, heated debates erupted over the latest parliamentary session. The clatter of wooden spoons against porcelain cups mingled with the smell of strong coffee and hot barley water. A fringe tidbit survives in a contemporary diary, noting that Franklin once pacified an irate lord by offering him a bottle of colonial rum smuggled in his coat pocket, an unconventional gift that reportedly softened the man's stance on taxation. Though he pressed for more lenient policies, Franklin also absorbed British political culture. He attended lavish banquets at Carlton House, where the clink of crystal glasses and the low murmur of aristocratic voices formed a kind of diplomatic soundtrack. In these salons, silken draperies and gilt mirrors reflected candle flames, casting patterns on parquet floors. Franklin recorded the sensation of velvet sleeves brushing his arm and the taste of sugared almonds passed on silver trays, details that later informed his own entertaining style in Paris. When the American Revolution loomed, Franklin's role shifted from advocate to emissary. In 1776, he travelled to Paris, securing loans and military alliances that proved decisive. One mainstream historical fact is that Franklin negotiated the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with France in 1778, formalizing French support for the revolutionary cause. Historians still argue whether Franklin's famed pose in his simple fur-lined coat projected humility, or whether it was a calculated image aligning with French tastes for rustic charm. The French court embraced him as a living curiosity. At Versailles, ladies whispered about the tall American with rustic spectacles and a quizzical grin. The air inside the Hall of Mirrors glittered with reflected light, mingling with the faint aroma of jasmine from nearby gardens. Franklin's pockets often bulged with miniature scientific curiosities, electrified jars, magnetic specimens, which he displayed at informal soirees. A quirky anecdote recounts that he once demonstrated a Leyden jar's spark under the chandeliers, causing guests to jump and laughter to ripple through gilded galleries. Franklin's diplomatic success was not without controversy. In London, Tory newspapers lampooned him as a turncoat, printing caricatures of his owl-like glasses and calling him Dr. Lightning Rod. In Paris, conservative courtiers grumbled that his informal manners undermined royal protocol. Historians still argue whether these criticisms reflected genuine political concerns or courtly resentment of an outsider upstaging aristocrats. Sensory memories from Franklin's diplomatic years endure in personal correspondence. He described the snap of silk breeches when standing, the slight chill of marble floors in French palaces, and the distant toll of cathedral bells in London, announcing treaty signings. At midnight gatherings, servants carried trays of sugar-coated chestnuts and spiced wine, the spices lingering on guests' breath long after conversations ended. Franklin's negotiating style combined reasoned argument with personal charm. He furnished letters with concise bullet points, an approach ahead of its time, and often concluded with light humour to diffuse tension. One modern parallel might compare his tactics to a skilled mediator at a multinational summit, using both data and rapport to bridge intractable positions. By 1785, Franklin returned to Philadelphia, celebrated as a hero of both continents. His diplomatic tenure demonstrated that an inventor of lightning rods could also invent pathways to peace. Yet his work raised questions still debated. Did his scientific fame give him access to high society, or did his social skills transform scientific renown into diplomatic capital? In the twilight years of his life, Benjamin Franklin transitioned from relentless innovator and diplomat to a guiding elder statesman whose counsel helped shape the nascent United States. After returning permanently in 1785, he joined the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 787, lending his voice to debates over federal structure and civil liberties. One mainstream historical fact is that Franklin was the oldest delegate at the convention, at 81 years of age. Historians still argue whether his frail appearance and gentle manners masked a strategic intent to persuade younger delegates toward compromise, or whether his mere presence provided moral authority that quelled more contentious disputes. Inside Independence Hall, delegates endured sweltering summer days beneath high-ceilinged chambers, the air thick with perspiration and the faint odor of cigar smoke. Franklin, seated on a simple wooden bench, wore a dark brown suit of coarse wool that rubbed his skin uncomfortably, yet signaled humility. Witnesses described his gentle clearing of the throat before speaking, and the soft scratch of quill on parchment as he added amendments to draft articles. A fringe tidbit from a lesser-known journal recounts that Franklin once dozed briefly during a late-night session, waking startled and bending to add his signature last among the framers, a symbolic reminder that even the greatest minds need rest. Debate roared over issues such as representation and executive power. Franklin proposed, somewhat humorously, that the new government might adopt a sunken stove in the center of the chamber to symbolize balanced warmth, an analogy to keep all states equally heated. Historians still argue whether this metaphor helped diffuse tension or distracted delegates from more pressing constitutional questions. Nonetheless, his emphasis on unity and moderation influenced key compromises, including the creation of a bicameral legislature and provisions for the abolition of the slave trade after 20 years. Beyond formal sessions, Franklin nurtured younger statesmen like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Gouverneur Morris, offering candid advice during evening gatherings in his residence. The parlor's wooden floorboards groaned with each step, and the air swirled with the scent of burning pine logs as Franklin poured tea to accompany his counsel. One curious detail from a contemporaneous letter reveals that Franklin kept a small cage of canaries in his home, believing their song would lift delegates' spirits and remind them of harmony. Whether this practice was mere eccentricity or a deliberate tactic to soothe heated tempers remains a point of scholarly debate. As the Constitution neared ratification, Franklin wrote persuasive essays under the pseudonym Poor Richard, reminding citizens that we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. This aphorism, both a pragmatic caution and a rallying cry, echoed throughout pamphlets and taverns, galvanizing public support. One mainstream historical fact is that Franklin's writings appeared in newspapers across the 13 states, fostering a sense of shared identity. Historians still argue whether the success of the ratification campaign owed more to Franklin's literary skill or to broader political and economic motivations among the populace. In his final years, Franklin turned his attention to mentoring the next generation of American leaders. He conducted informal seminars on topics ranging from electricity to taxation, inviting protégés into his study lined with bookshelves. The scent of aged leather bindings mingled with the faint, chalky aroma of his experimental apparatus, reminding visitors of his dual devotion to learning and practical problem-solving. A fringe anecdote tells of a young attendee who attempted to replicate Franklin's electrostatic experiments and accidentally set his wig ablaze, prompting Franklin to gently remind him that curiosity must be tempered with caution. Franklin's death on April 17, 1790, drew a public outpouring of grief unparalleled in early America. Mourners described the funeral cortege winding through Philadelphia streets lined with banners and the tolling of church bells, each chime resonating like a heartbeat recalling his energy. The air carried the scent of fresh lilacs and the hush of a stunned city coming to terms with its loss. One modern comparison notes that Franklin's state funeral resembled those of contemporary heads of state, underscoring the magnitude of his impact. In death, as in life, Franklin left instructions that blended pragmatism with empathy. His will provided for the care of his common-law wife, Deborah, and modestly funded educational institutions. He famously requested that his epitaph, which he drafted himself, celebrate his virtues and contributions, rather than the usual encomiums. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out, stripped of its lettering, gilding, lies here, food for worms. but the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more, in a new, more perfect edition, corrected, amended by the author. Historians still argue whether this self-authored epitaph reflected genuine humility or a final wry commentary on life's impermanence. Franklin's legacy endures in institutions bearing his name: libraries, universities, and even elementary schools, and in the countless inventions and civic innovations that continue to shape modern society. The soft hum of electricity through modern wires, the measured pulse of the US Constitution, and the spirit of pragmatic inquiry all trace back to the man who harnessed lightning and crafted a republic. His life story reminds observers that innovation and leadership often proceed hand in hand, each sparking the other toward a brighter, more connected future. By 1901, Nikola Tesla's grand vision of a world linked by wireless power took shape on the shores of Long Island at Wardenclyffe. Funded initially by J.P. Morgan and erected on a 20-acre estate in Shoreham, the tower rose to a height of 187 feet, topped by a 10-story metal dome, nearly 68 feet in diameter. This mainstream historical fact underscores the scale of Tesla's ambition: to transmit not only messages but usable energy without wires, lighting homes and factories across continents. Historians still argue whether this project was technically feasible with the period's materials, or whether it outstripped the limits of early 20th century engineering. The tower's skeletal pine framework and corrugated iron shell presented an imposing silhouette against the salty air of Long Island Sound. Visitors recalled the sharp tang of sea breeze mingling with the smell of hot pitch used to seal the wooden joints, and the faint ozone scent whenever Tesla's coils fired during test runs. At night, arc lamps strung along the tower's base cast a pale, flickering glow, making the structure appear like a great mechanical lighthouse. One quirky tidbit from a contractor's diary describes how local fishermen mistook the tower's lights for ghost ships, steering clear of the waters until dawn. Construction crews worked in shifting coastal light, their hammers echoing against the clank of steel reinforcements and the occasional hiss of escaping steam from generators. Steam whistles marked shift changes, blending with the cry of gulls overhead. Engineers wearing wool coats and leather gloves tightened brass fittings on the dome's surface, noting that every bolt sounded a slightly different ping when struck, a rudimentary method to check tightness before official gauges arrived. This sensory detail illustrates the artisanal nature of early wireless engineering. Tesla's laboratory at the tower's base housed the machinery that would drive the dream. Inside the brick powerhouse, massive alternators droned low like distant thunder, and vacuum tubes glowed with a faint orange light. The constant vibration made the wooden floors creak beneath technicians' boots, while the smell of heated oil from transformers lingered in every corner. A fringe observation in a companion memoir describes Tesla wearing a fur-lined overcoat in the lab, claiming the chilly draft improved the purity of his high-voltage experiments. Central to Tesla's design was a subterranean network of copper pipes and grounding rods driven deep into the sand. These acted as earth capacitors, allowing the tower to resonate with the planet's electrical charge. Historians still argue whether Tesla's understanding of the Earth as a conductor was accurate, or if the losses in the ground would have prevented efficient energy transmission. Some modern analyses suggest that the ground return path would have dissipated most of the power long before it reached distant receivers. Tesla envisaged distant receiving towers that would mirror Wardenclyffe's design at smaller scales. In published diagrams, he showed a globe topped by a mast, tuned to the same frequency so that the Earth itself became a conductor. He predicted that a single station could light entire cities without the need for transmission lines. Yet while the theoretical resonance principle rested on Maxwell's electromagnetic field theory, Tesla's specific frequency selections and tuning methods remain a matter of debate among scholars, with some contending that his frequencies would have fallen short of coupling efficiently through the globe. Local residents witnessed occasional test discharges that sent sparks dancing across open switches, accompanied by a crackling roar like distant artillery fire. Tesla technicians reported seeing a faint violet corona around the dome, as if the metal were breathing electricity into the night sky. One anecdote recounts that a family living 2 miles away saw their window panes faintly vibrate when Tesla pulsed the system, a curious effect that some dismissed as optical illusion. Such reports fueled public fascination, even as financial backers grew wary. Financial strains emerged when Morgan declined further funding, doubting the commercial returns. By 1904, construction slowed, and Tesla's attention shifted to patent battles and smaller laboratory ventures. Debate persists over whether more capital would have completed Wardenclyffe, or whether foundational flaws doomed the project from the start. Some historians point to inadequate insulation materials and limited high-voltage transformers as critical bottlenecks that no amount of money could overcome at the time. After the lab's abandonment in 1906, its massive tower stood silent against windswept dunes, gradually rusting and drawing local law. One peculiar legend held that midnight moonlight triggered ghostly sparks atop the dome, though no photographic evidence supports such claims. Engineers who later examined the site noted that corrosion had eaten through key joints, but that the core foundation remained remarkably intact, a testament to early 20th century construction standards. Today, archaeological surveys and archival research aim to reconstruct Tesla's workshop layout. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed the network of grounding rods and remnants of concrete pathways that once guided technicians between the powerhouse and the tower. Scholars have pieced together Maxwell-style resonance equations with Tesla's patent drawings to simulate what might have transpired inside the lab. Historians still argue whether those simulations accurately reflect real-world performance or rely too heavily on idealized assumptions. Sensory reconstructions performed in modern replica facilities attempt to recreate the hallmarks of Tesla's experiments: the low-frequency hum of generators, the hiss of high-voltage discharge, and the glow of early neon indicators. Enthusiasts equipped with thermal cameras catch fleeting temperature spikes at arc gaps, while sound engineers tease out the infrasonic rumbles that viewers once only felt underfoot. These immersive reenactments bring Tesla's hidden secrets into the present, allowing today's observers to sense, however briefly, the electricity that once thrummed through Wardenclyffe. In the years following his Wardenclyffe venture, Tesla retreated to smaller workshop spaces in Manhattan and Colorado Springs to focus on high-voltage, high-frequency experiments that would become his hallmark. In 1899, at his Colorado Springs laboratory, Tesla constructed giant coils nearly 30 feet tall and powered by modified generators, producing thousands of volts at increasing frequencies. One mainstream historical fact is that Tesla's experiments in Colorado Springs led to the development of the resonant transformer circuit, now known as the Tesla coil. Historians still argue whether Tesla's choice of operating frequencies, often reaching into the low megahertz range, was optimal for wireless power transmission, or if lower frequencies would have delivered more efficient coupling through the atmosphere. At sunset, the lab's cavernous interior glowed with the soft orange of filament lamps, but the true spectacle began when the coils fired. Sparks hundreds of feet long arced from the primary to secondary windings, cracking through the dim air like captured lightning. Witnesses described a sharp hiss as ionized air warped into glowing tendrils, accompanied by the unmistakable odor of ozone that stung the nasal passages and lingered on clothing. One fringe tidbit recounts that a visiting engineer once found his hair standing on end after standing too close to the secondary coil, the high-frequency field inducing a static lift that startled even Tesla himself. Inside the lab, the constant hum of rotary converters mingled with the distant groan of wooden beams flexing under mechanical stress. Wooden platforms in one room bore scorch marks, where stray arcs had leapt unexpectedly, leaving small craters and deposits of annealed copper. Technicians wore leather gauntlets and wool coats to ward off shocks, their gloves crackling faintly whenever they adjusted grounding wires. The air rippled with heat shimmering atop heated insulators, revealing currents invisible to the eye. Tesla's notebooks from this period detail the mathematical relationships he observed between coil dimensions, turns ratios, and resonant frequency. He meticulously recorded voltages measured by his own spark gap voltmeter, calibrated with sliding spheres whose separation produced predictable spark lengths. Yet historians still argue whether Tesla's measurement methods accurately captured peak voltages, or if unrecognized leakage currents skewed his data toward overly optimistic results. The ambiguity leaves modern scholars debating the true power levels achieved in his most dramatic demonstrations. In one famous display, Tesla lit incandescent bulbs held aloft without any wires, simply by placing them within the radiated field of his coil. Bulbs illuminated with a cold white glow despite being coated in standard filaments, revealing that high-frequency currents could excite the gas inside. Spectators recounted watching the bulbs suspended by silk threads, their glass envelopes shimmering with light like captive stars. A curious anecdote from a laboratory journal notes that some bulbs emitted a faint musical tone when energized, possibly caused by mechanical vibrations of the filament at radio frequencies. Not all experiments succeeded as planned. Tesla documented frequent coil misfires that vaporized wires or shattered glass transformers. One entry describes a sudden overvoltage that caused a steam boiler in the next room to whistle in sympathetic resonance, prompting panicked technicians to evacuate. He noted the room shook for several seconds, and the smell of burnt shellac from coil insulation permeated every corner. These setbacks underscored the challenges of containing and directing energy of such magnitude. Tesla's pursuit of high-frequency currents also led him into controversial terrain. He claimed that at very high frequencies, electricity behaved not as a flow of electrons, but as pressure waves traversing the medium, an early intuition that foreshadowed the concept of electromagnetic radiation. Historians still argue whether Tesla's theoretical framework anticipated later discoveries by Hertz and Maxwell, or whether his interpretations simply repackaged established field theory in novel language. Regardless, his first-hand observations of glowing discharge patterns inspired a generation of radio pioneers. Amid the thunderous arcs and laboratory hazards, Tesla maintained a ritual of silence before each demonstration. He insisted all observers leave the immediate coil area, then sat alone in a chair to observe the initial spark, believing the uninterrupted view sharpened his perception of subtle variations. A fringe account tells of an assistant who once crept back to the chair during a test, only to find his shoe melted by proximity to a latent hotspot on the coil base. Tesla later remarked that every experiment contained both danger and revelation in equal measure. By 1902, Tesla had refined his coils into more manageable desktop models that he showcased in lecture halls. Audiences gasped as he enveloped himself in a cage of sparks, the currents remaining outside the protective metal grid. The exhibit conveyed the safety and power of alternating current, challenging fears born of earlier direct current shocks. Critics in press reports questioned whether the demonstration was mere theatre or genuine proof of AC superiority. Historians still argue whether Tesla's theatrical flair advanced public acceptance of alternating current or distracted from the concurrent work of engineers like Westinghouse. At the heart of these experiments remained Tesla's unwavering belief that high-frequency currents could transmit power without wires. He wrote in his 1,900 patent applications that the Earth itself could serve as a conductor and dielectric, with proper tuning allowing energy to leap from transmitter to receiver like a tidal wave. A mainstream fact is that Tesla's patents described methods for both wireless telegraphy and power transfer using grounded resonant circuits. Debates continue over the viability of such systems given real-world losses and interference, leaving the question partly unresolved. Despite mounting skepticism, Tesla's high-frequency research influenced early radio inventors. Guglielmo Marconi's transatlantic transmissions in 1901 built upon technologies that Tesla had demonstrated years earlier. Yet historians still argue whether Marconi's success owed more to his own refinements or to the foundational experiments conducted in Tesla's laboratories. Patent battles would soon determine who received credit and royalties, but the scientific debt remained shared. In lecture halls, Tesla ended each demonstration by dimming the lights and letting the secondary coil's soft glow fade, leaving only the hushed echo of residual currents. The atmosphere turned reverential, as though the audience had witnessed a glimpse of nature's hidden pulse. Though many details remain debated, these high-voltage, high-frequency experiments stand as testament to Tesla's genius and his willingness to push the boundaries of known physics for the promise of wireless wonder. In secluded drawers and dusty filing cabinets of Tesla's New York workshop lay blueprints for machines that never saw daylight. Among them was a detailed schematic for a teleforce weapon, later sensationalized as the death ray. which Tesla described as a charged particle projector capable of disabling engines and ground troops at 20 miles distance. One mainstream historical fact is that Tesla filed patents outlining a method of generating narrow beams of accelerated particles for defense purposes. Historians still argue whether such a device could pivot the balance of power in early 20th century conflicts, or whether the concept fell apart under the weight of practical physics. Tesla's notes reveal that he imagined using a vacuum tube emitter and a series of electrostatic lenses to focus streams of minute particles. Sketches show cylindrical chambers etched with concentric rings for voltage gradients, connected to coils that would generate millions of volts. The writing is meticulous yet fanciful. Tesla claimed the device would produce an unbroken stream of particles charged with tremendous energy that could halt armies like horses frozen mid-gallop. A fringe tidbit suggests he experimented with early prototypes by directing charged streams at rusted metal plates, noting the plates blackened but failed to vaporize. A sobering hint at the gulf between theory and reality. Beyond weapons, Tesla drafted designs for a flying machine powered by bladeless turbines and guided by wireless commands. He envisioned a saucer-shaped craft with an array of Tesla coils generating lift through high-voltage corona discharge. In one set of drawings, he labeled regions of the hull primary resonator and secondary stabilizer, suggesting he believed resonance with the Earth's own electric field could provide propulsion. Mainstream fact holds that Tesla did discuss aerodynamic resonance in private letters, yet historians still argue whether these plans reflect serious aeronautical engineering or a flight of imaginative fancy unanchored by aerodynamics. Tesla also refined the idea of free energy generators that tapped into ambient radiant energy. A mysterious supply, he thought, permeated cosmic space. He drafted coils tuned to pick up what he called cosmic rays, or radiant matter, confident that his receivers could harvest continuous power without fuel. His patent filings mention an apparatus for utilizing the energy of the medium, implying an inexhaustible source. Historians still argue whether Tesla's radiant energy theory presaged zero-point energy concepts, or whether it simply misinterpreted ubiquitous electromagnetic noise as a usable feedstock for power generation. In the margins of one faded ledger, Tesla sketched devices for controlling gravity. He labeled a horizontal bar electrostatic girdle, intended to alter mass distribution within an object. A quirky anecdote mentions that Tesla believed this girdle could reduce an object's gravitational attraction, allowing heavy machinery to become effectively weightless. Despite the allure, no formal documentation survives to show he moved beyond scribbled diagrams. Historians still argue whether Tesla's gravity theories were early attempts at unified field concepts, or mere speculation born of his isolation in the workshop. Sensory descriptions from acquaintances underscore the atmosphere surrounding these unrealized inventions. One visitor recalled stepping into the lab and feeling an almost imperceptible vibration in the air, as if charged particles drizzled around the walls like invisible hail. The smell of machine oil and heated brass mingled with a faint scent of burning mica from coils left energized overnight. Tesla's assistants noted that the hum of active resonators sometimes caused nearby teacups to tremble, spilling little puddles of Earl Grey on the workbenches. Patent offices in London, Paris, and Washington hold tens of pages of correspondence in which Tesla defended his ideas against skeptical examiners. He insisted the death ray weapon would usher in an era of lasting peace by making invasion impossible. Such a claim drew sarcastic commentary in European journals, one describing it as the peace through terror proposal. Historians still argue whether Tesla's earnest belief in deterrence was visionary or delusional, given the technological constraints of the era. Tesla's habit of charging circuits overnight introduced practical risks. Lab logs record small fires sparked by unattended coils, leaving scorch marks on hardwood floors and singed notebooks. One entry mentions a fire extinguisher discharged in desperation, plunging the lab into darkness and causing a cacophony of clattering tools and startled shouts. Though Tesla downplayed these incidents in public, private letters suggest he feared an accidental detonation of his particle projector could raise the workshop. Despite the hazards, Tesla meticulously catalogued each idea, convinced the world simply lacked the materials and production methods to realize his designs. His notebooks include material lists, calling for vacuum pumps, capable of reducing pressure to near absolute zero, and insulating ceramics with dielectric strength beyond what steel or glass could provide. Historians still argue whether Tesla actually believed these materials would become available, or whether he used the extreme requirements as a way to preserve his intellectual legacy beyond immediate replication. After Tesla's death in 1943, the US Office of Alien Property seized his papers, and many designs vanished into classified archives. Some engineers and archivists later claimed to retrieve partial plans for the Teleforce device, though dogs and rodents had gnawed through original documents. A fringe rumor holds that a covert unit experimented with recovered resonator circuits, leading to unconfirmed reports of power surges in nearby towns. Mainstream historians dismiss this as mythical, yet debate persists over how much of Tesla's hidden work was lost, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed. Modern scholars piecing together fragments of Tesla's unrealized inventions face a challenge. Surviving sketches often lack crucial schematics. Layered views of coil windings and detailed electrode dimensions are absent. One project attempted to mathematically reconstruct Tesla's particle accelerator designs, only to find the required voltage levels would have exceeded any generator then or since built. Historians still argue whether Tesla's ambition outstripped his ability to document practical engineering steps, or whether some unknown collaborator might have held the missing pages. Though many of these devices never left the drawing board, their allure endures. Science fiction writers have long borrowed Tesla's death ray concept, weaving it into stories of alternate histories and steampunk adventures. Tech enthusiasts reconstruct Tesla coil arrays in backyard workshops, chasing that dream of wireless power and resonant phenomena. Even if the death ray and gravity girdle remain myths, the creative spark Tesla ignited continues to light imaginations, reminding observers that innovation often lives as vividly in unrealized dreams as in completed inventions. Tesla's explorations into X-rays and radiant energy represent some of the most enigmatic chapters of his laboratory work, conducted in both Colorado Springs and New York between 1896 and 1905. In early experiments, he repurposed his high-voltage coils to generate X-rays before Wilhelm Röntgen's discoveries became widely adopted, proving that electrical discharges could penetrate thin materials. One mainstream historical fact is that Tesla documented early X-ray photographs, shadographs, he called them, of bones and metallic objects, though he published sparingly to avoid rival patent claims. Historians still argue whether Tesla's images rivaled Röntgen's clarity, or if his unconventional apparatus yielded only murky silhouettes. Inside Tesla's laboratory, vacuum tubes glowed with a ghostly blue light when energized, casting eerie shadows on walls lined with shelves of glass cylinders and metal electrodes. Technicians recalled the room growing ominously silent as tubes powered up, then crackling and spitting as residual gases ionized under intense fields. The smell of heated glass and copper filled the air, tinged with burnt mica flakes falling like ash. A fringe tidbit describes Tesla holding a brass stud between his fingers as a faint X-ray pattern imprinted on photographic plates strapped to his arm, resulting in faint circular burns on the film and his skin. Beyond X-rays, Tesla pursued radiant energy, a form of emission he believed permeated space, separate from electromagnetic waves. He theorized that ultraviolet light and cosmic rays represented different flavors of radiant energy, capable of transferring power through the ether. In private notebooks, he sketched devices combining phosphorescent screens and metal plates designed to capture these elusive emissions. Historians still argue whether Tesla's radiant energy concept anticipates modern ideas of solar power conversion, or whether it misinterprets ultraviolet phenomena as a universal power source. Tesla described one key experiment in letters to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, recounting how he charged a custom radiant energy receiver at dusk. He reported that the device generated a steady current from the diffuse glow of the sky, even when clouds obscured the sun. One mainstream fact notes that Tesla filed a patent in 1901 for a method of harnessing radiant energy, though commercial success eluded him. Debate persists over whether his receivers actually produced usable power or if experimental errors, like unintended electrostatic induction, explained the observed currents. Sensory details from these trials linger in memoirs of early collaborators. One assistant described the laboratory's tungsten filament lamps dimming slightly when the radiant receiver was exposed to moonlight, a curious effect that Tesla noted but never fully explained. Another recounts the hiss of a small motor kept running by the receiver during hours of darkness, accompanied by a faint, high-pitched hum that sounded more like distant cicadas than electricity. Tesla's ambivalence about publishing full results limited broader scientific engagement. He preferred live demonstrations for select audiences, allowing him to control interpretation. One anecdote recalls a private demo before US government officials, where Tesla claimed his radiant device could power telegraph instruments indefinitely. The officials, skeptical and lacking repeatable trials, declined to fund further development. Historians still argue whether Tesla's reticence stemmed from perfectionism or from a strategic desire to protect his intellectual property. Despite limited recognition in his lifetime, modern researchers have revisited Tesla's radiant energy patents. Laboratory reconstructions using photodiode arrays and modern insulating materials attempt to replicate his results under controlled conditions. Some teams report faint currents harvested under bright sunlight, though losses in modern semiconductors complicate direct comparison. These efforts fuel renewed debate. Was Tesla on the verge of a new era of energy harvesting, or were his claims a curious footnote in electrical history? Regardless of outcome, Tesla's X-ray and radiant experiments underscore his insatiable drive to push beyond accepted boundaries. He treated every electrical phenomenon as a potential resource, believing that nature concealed limitless power for those bold enough to seek it. Though many questions remain unresolved, these hidden secrets illuminate Tesla's experimental spirit, blurring the line between pioneering science and visionary dream. Long after Tesla's departure, Wardenclyffe's tower and its companion laboratory fell into ruin, leaving behind only skeletal remains and scattered artifacts that whispered of past grandeur. By 1917, during World War I, the rusted dome was dismantled and sold for scrap to help fund the war effort, leaving behind a concrete foundation and fragments of iron girders. These forgotten relics lay buried under dunes and wild grasses, until modern enthusiasts began piecing together Tesla's forgotten workshop. Historians still argue whether enough physical evidence survives to reconstruct the original facility accurately, or whether much of our vision remains speculation pieced together from patent drawings and second-hand accounts. In recent decades, archaeologists and historians have employed ground-penetrating radar to map the subterranean network of grounding rods Tesla drove into the sand. These probes revealed parallel lines radiating from the tower's base, confirming descriptions of copper pipes that once connected to earth capacitors. Volunteers brushing away decades of sand uncovered fragments of ceramic insulators, scorched by decades of high-voltage tests. One quirky detail describes finding a handful of fused glass beads, likely byproducts of early arc discharges, suggesting that Tesla's sparks may have melted nearby materials during experiments. Archival research in New York and Michigan turned up crates of original Tesla papers, including letters hinting at workshop layouts and equipment inventories. Sketches indicated the placement of spark gaps, transformers, and control panels, offering clues about the lab's configuration. Yet significant gaps remain. Historians still argue whether the main powerhouse contained a single giant alternator or multiple smaller generators arranged in parallel, as Tesla's correspondents variously described both setups. Field surveys at the original Shoreham site also uncovered remnants of a small administrative building where Tesla and his assistants kept logs and corresponded with backers. Deep in the soil, faded ink on soaking wet paper survived in sealed metal boxes, detailing experiments and daily observations. One diary entry, smudged but legible, described a night when sparks lit the dunes like distant campfires, prompting a group of local farmers to gather at the beach to watch the eerie display. These first-hand accounts lend a human touch to the archaeological profile. Beyond Wardenclyffe, efforts to locate Tesla's later Manhattan lab sites have revealed surprising finds. In a converted industrial building on Houston Street, engineers discovered reinforced concrete floors bearing scorch marks, evidence of high-voltage arcs. Hidden within a false wall, a rack of brass switch plates and vintage insulator mounts surfaced, hinting at where Tesla once controlled coil outputs. Historians still argue whether this site served as a primary research facility or merely a demonstration space for wealthy patrons. Museums and private collectors have also played a role in preserving Tesla's legacy. The Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade houses tens of thousands of objects, from childhood correspondence to functional coil components. Visitors report feeling a faint hum when walking near restored coils, an immersive sensory hint at Tesla's experimental environment. One fringe anecdote involves a guided tour where a replica spark gap triggered unexpectedly, causing nearby light fixtures to dim momentarily. A modern echo of Tesla's dream of visiting power without wires. Reconstruction projects have attempted to recreate Tesla's apparatus based on surviving blueprints. At a laboratory in Colorado, engineers built a replica Tesla coil, matching original dimensions, generating controlled sparks under strict safety protocols. Acoustic measurements captured the characteristic hiss and whistle of discharge, while high-speed cameras recorded the branching patterns of arcs. These experiments informed debates about Tesla's claimed power levels, though historians still argue whether such modern replicas accurately reflect early 20th century materials and techniques. Virtual reality simulations offer another path to rediscovery. Using 3D laser scans of existing ruins and archival photos, developers have crafted immersive tours of Wardenclyffe and other labs. Users navigate virtual corridors, hearing creaks of wooden beams and smelling digitally rendered ozone. While no physical trace remains of Tesla's original control panels, interactive models allow explorers to flip teak handles and watch spark patterns flash across the sky, blending sensory reconstruction with interpretive storytelling. Despite these endeavors, some Tesla sites remain lost. In the 1940s, New York City cleared a workshop at 35 South Fifth Avenue without preserving its contents, consigning artifacts to landfill. Other labs in Colorado Springs were demolished to make way for suburban development, erasing physical clues forever. Historians still argue whether lost sites can be partially reconstructed through diaries and third-party notes, or if some aspects of Tesla's workspace are irretrievably gone. Yet the quest to unearth Tesla's hidden laboratories continues to inspire. Community groups host excavation digs with metal detectors and trowels, searching for fragments of insulators or coil windings. Amateur radio enthusiasts tune vintage receivers to capture faint electromagnetic emissions near former lab locations, hopeful for a spectral echo of Tesla's high-frequency tests. These passionate efforts remind observers that discovery is not only about grand breakthroughs, but also about the patient unearthing of history's buried artifacts. Now that we have traced every echo of Tesla's lab, from the vanished silhouette of Wardenclyffe to the silent hum of radiant receivers, allow your thoughts to settle like dust on a forgotten blueprint. Imagine walking away from the clamor of coils and spark gaps, leaving behind the hiss of ionized air and the sharp tang of ozone. Let the memory of glowing tubes and crackling arcs fade into a gentle darkness. You need not solve the mysteries or debate the viability of death rays and wireless power. Instead, rest in the wonder that drove one man to chase every spark and shadow, convinced that the universe teemed with unseen forces awaiting capture. Feel the warmth of a fading filament lamp, hear the distant murmur of instruments winding down, and sense the stillness that follows even the grandest experiment. As you drift, recall that every lab ruin and scattered paper fragment belongs to a story larger than any single machine. Tesla's hidden secrets live in the curiosity he kindled in others. The engineers who reconstruct coils, the historians who piece together patents, and the dreamers who imagine free energy for all. In that shared pursuit, you join a lineage of seekers who labor not for certainty but for possibility. Now, inhale slowly, noticing the gentle rise of your chest. Exhale any lingering tension, letting it dissolve like electrical charge returning to Earth. Your journey through Tesla's world has uncovered marvel and mystery, but now the world of quiet calm awaits. Let your breath carry you downward, into the soft currents of sleep, where new discoveries tiptoe at the edge of dreams. Sweet dreams.